All right, well, good evening, everyone. Happy Monday. Hope everything is going well for you and your week is off to a good start. Welcome to what is officially week number 4. So we are moving along very quickly in our time together. I guess after tonight, we'll be pretty much halfway through, if you can believe that. But for tonight, what I have planned for us is to talk primarily about accountability and ethics. And it's important that we talk about this tonight because that will then get us ready for our next Canvas essay, as well as that public accountability and ethics paper that you'll be turning in next week. So what I thought we would do tonight is we'll talk through our issues in terms of accountability and ethics in the public sector. Then I have a breakout room assignment that we're going to do. So you can stop listening to me for a while and get to talk to each other and start, getting to know each other a little bit more. And so we'll do that after we cover our information accountability and ethics. Then when we're done with our breakout group assignment, then we will talk a bit about the public accountability and ethics paper. I'll answer whatever questions you have then at that time. And just make sure we're all on the same page with both that assignment as well as Canvas essay number 4, which we'll be pulling from information that we cover tonight as well. So basically tonight is going to be all about public sector accountability and ethics. Then next week, in week number 5, we'll get into a discussion of the unique environment of public administration. We'll talk about some of the stakeholders who are involved in that unique, very political and dynamic and changing environment. We'll talk about things like governing networks and the opportunities for cooperation, predicating everything on the idea of systems theory and how public administration, public organizations operate within this very open type of system. And so we'll do all that in terms of the environment of public administration then for our session next Monday. So without further ado, let's get into a somewhat brief discussion of accountability and ethics in the public sector. This is by design a relatively brief introduction because you will be talking about accountability and ethics in future courses in the program as well. So most, if not all, of the courses in the program will touch on ethics and accountability in one nature or another. We do know that one of the main objectives of the program focuses on ethics and accountability, and so that's why we've incorporated here as an introduction here in the MPA 610 course. So what is accountability? I think that we do have a very good understanding of the role of public administrators in comparison to the role of elected officials. So, as we know from our discussion of the foundational principles of American government, we know that we are a constitutional republic or a democratic republic. As a republic, we elect people to go to Washington or to Sacramento or to Los Angeles to make decisions for us. And those elected officials are then held directly accountable, or at least in theory, are held directly accountable to the voters. Now, I think you can probably make an argument about just how directly accountable they are with some of the ways in which we draw districts in this country.
Wait,
I think it's quite possible that you could say, well, with the way in which we draw our House districts and all these redistricting efforts, maybe it's more difficult for some groups to hold their elected officials accountable than for others. But at least in theory, in a Republican small r form of government, elected officials the public hold their elected officials accountable at the ballot box. We as public administrators, as we all know, are not elected. And so we do not have that same connective tissue with the public as elected officials do. So instead, here as public administrators, because we are appointed and we are appointed based upon our knowledge, skills, and abilities, based upon our merit principles, we are not held directly accountable. So the way in which the public, in theory, can hold administrators accountable is through that conduit of their elected officials. So that means there's a very pronounced role, in theory, for elected officials to play in holding administrators accountable. Ethics and accountability really looks at this relationship between people and things. typically we're looking at the relationship for our purposes between public administrators and the types of things that they manage on a daily basis. So it's a relationship between people and things. Accountability is really the foundation of bureaucracy because it again allows these elected officials to hold administrators accountable for their actions, and then the voters hold elected officials accountable for their actions. So the elected officials are kind of that intervening variable between the public and between public administrators. Well, that's the nice civics explanation for this relationship between the public, elected officials, and administrators. We know the civics explanation is not always sufficient because in the real world of public administration, oftentimes elected officials are very hesitant. They're very reluctant to hold administrators accountable because when they engage in accountability, there is the potential that they are going to uncover problems. And there are a lot of negative associations that elected officials have with holding administrators and holding agencies accountable. They then become connected to the problem. If they, as elected officials, become connected to the problem, it then hurts their reelection prospects. And as a very famous political scientist, David Mayhew, told us way back in 1974, the primary motivation of elected officials, especially members of Congress, is to simply get reelected. And it's more difficult to get reelected if the public will hold you accountable and hold you responsible for some problem that's occurred in government. So usually we have elected officials for their own reelection prospects who try to maintain some distance from the accountability requirement. So elected officials really want to try and avoid this clear chain of accountability so they are not held accountable in return. But the way in which our system is designed is that members of Congress, these elected officials, are the overseers of the bureaucracy. At the federal level, Congress passes appropriations. Congress creates these agencies, they create these programs, they create these policies through legislation. Congress creates civil service requirements and can decide whether or not those civil service requirements are enforceable or not. But all this flows out of Congress at the federal level. So when it flows out of Congress at the federal level, then those members of Congress become the overseers of administrators. That is what's known as the principal-agent relationship. The principal-agent relationship is at the very heart of the process of ethical adherence. In the principal-agent relationship, we have a principal, and that principal is the overseer. For our example, the member of Congress or the member of the state legislature. The agent is the agency, a federal agency or a state agency. You would think in a principal-agent relationship, the principal would have the most information, and they could then utilize that information to then oversee the actions of the agent. The truth of the matter is, we know that it's really the agent, the agency that has the information. Who knows best how programs and policies are being implemented than members of that agency who are implementing those policies on a daily basis? So in reality, with this principal-agent relationship, the first problem we run into is this problem of information asymmetry. Information asymmetry, the agent actually has more information than the principal. This information asymmetry problem then leads to a second problem, which is known as the problem of moral hazard. Agency members are then placed into a moral hazard because they then have to decide what information and how much information they should give to the elected officials who are overseeing their actions. There is a disincentive naturally to provide a lot of information to overseers because the more information overseers have, the more information they then have to scrutinize the actions of those agencies. So there's a natural inclination to not want to provide that information. And that's where this moral hazard comes in. However, as we will see as we get toward the end of this discussion tonight, the American Society for Public Administration provides us with 8 ethical principles that we as public administrators are supposed to adhere to. Principle number 5 is to fully inform and advise. So we are expected to fully inform and advise elected officials who are charged with the responsibility of overseeing the actions of administrators. However, because of that moral hazard, we really have to overcome that disincentive to provide that information. The problem obviously is in the principal-agent relationship, when the agent has more information than the principal doesn't have the information to know what types of questions to ask. So those questions never get asked in those oversight hearings. If you've ever watched any of those oversight hearings in Congress, and you know anything about the agency that's appearing before the committee, it can be really frustrating. And that you're listening for certain questions that come from members of Congress, and you never hear those questions, because members of Congress don't know that those are the questions that they are supposed to ask. So the principal-agent relationship can be a major problem with this whole oversight responsibility of elected officials. Another potential problem with oversight is in terms of the use of executive privilege. We see this frequently at the federal level. Modern-day administrations are very fond of using executive privilege. And so they will say, I am going to assert executive privilege so that this administrator is not able to provide this information to Congress, because this is information that was discussed with the chief executive, with the president. So I'm exerting executive privilege. The more assertions of executive privilege, the less likely it is that members of Congress will get the information they need in order to properly conduct their oversight functions. And this assertion of executive privilege, or the inclination to assert executive privilege, doesn't belong to one party or another, doesn't belong to one administration or another. We've seen administrations from both parties assert executive privilege. But the more executive privilege you have, the less likely you are to get the information that you need as an elected official to properly conduct your oversight responsibilities. Oversight is obviously important because it really helps us strike that balance between the rules and regulations that administrators are meant to adhere to and their ability to effectively meet the wants, needs, and desires of the public that they are supposed to serve. A lot of rules and regulations may inhibit bold action and may make it more difficult for us to attract the best administrators into the public service. So we really have to strike a balance between the external controls in order to hold people accountable for their actions, while at the same time maintaining enough flexibility and latitude so that administrators are not afraid to make decisions and will make those bold and innovative and creative types of choices. So it's very much that balance. And this whole discussion we're going to have tonight really is oriented around trying to maintain that balance of enough accountability measures without having too many accountability measures to stifle the creativity of administrators. So how have we approached accountability and ethics in the public sector over the past 140 years or so of being an academic discipline? There have been 3 basic approaches to how we have dealt with the issue of accountability and ethics. The first approach is what's known as the legal boundaries approach. The legal boundaries approach is rooted in the Woodrow Wilson politics administration dichotomy. So back in 1887, and you'll read this article and we'll discuss this article, but in 1887, Woodrow Wilson wrote this seminal article called The Study of Administration. Well, the primary arguments that Wilson made in his article is that the work of government has become very complex. It has become so complex that we need to really develop a science or a study of administration. And he argued, if we can pull administration out of politics, if we can separate the political world from the administrative world, we can better focus on the administrative world, and then we can study and learn how to better do the what he called business of government. So he said the business of government is the everyday work that goes on within these agencies to implement and execute these policies and these programs. So if we can focus on administration separately from politics, then we can come up with better and more efficient ways of doing that type of administration. Also, if we can separate politics from administration, we can then borrow innovations from other countries and apply those innovations to the way in which we administer our programs. We can borrow innovations from the British civil service system, things such as competitive examinations, and apply those innovations to our system to make our system more effective and more efficient because we have divorced it from politics. So what that politics administration dichotomy meant in the late 1800s and the early 1900s is that it kind of gave us a bright line distinction between what types of activities were considered to be ethical on the part of administrators versus what types of activities were considered to be unethical. So if we had an administrator who was engaged in administration, they were solely engaged in the implementation and execution of these policies that were given to them by the legislative body. They were engaged in the administrative world. They were engaged in ethical behavior. However, if we saw administrators then start to cross that line and go into the political world, so if we saw administrators who started playing politics in terms of which policies get adopted by a legislative body, once they start playing politics, that is then crossing that bright ethical line. They are not now then engaging in something that could be considered to be unethical. So if administrators are on the administrative side, that's ethical behavior. They cross over to the political world. That is then what could be considered to be unethical behavior. And that was the importance of this politics administration dichotomy. Likewise, elected officials are supposed to be in the political world. They're the ones who are supposed to be formulating, be making these policies, and then they leave it to the administrators to implement. If politicians then get involved in micromanaging administration, then that would be something that's crossing that line, and that would be something that is a role that they should not be playing as elected officials. So it's a very black and white, very distinctive line between the political and the administrative world, and we know where administrators belong and we know where politicians belong. So it's a very clear type of demarcation between ethical and unethical behavior. Well, the problem with the politics administration dichotomy is we learned very early on in the early 1900s that there really wasn't this bright line distinction between the political and the administrative world. That administrators, yes, indeed, they are involved in the implementation and execution of policies and programs, but they're also involved in the formulation of those policies as well. They provide advice to elected officials in terms of how to formulate these policies. So they are involved in that side of the world, which is really the political world as well. And that's not necessarily unethical. They are providing their expertise to try and make these policies better when they are being formulated in the legislative branch. So the politics administration dichotomy was very quickly seen as being, number one, not realistic, and number two, just far too simplistic in terms of trying to determine what is ethical versus unethical types of behavior. That was something that was pointed out very clearly to us by a very famous public administration theorist by the name of John Gauss. And we'll talk about John Gauss a couple of times tonight. But John Gauss in 1936 pointed out that laws are not always clear, and it's really impossible for us to have that bright line distinction between policy formulation and policy implementation. So therefore, it's not fair for us to say administrator is acting unethically because they are acting in the policy formulation side of the world. Then later on in the 1940s, we had a major debate going on between two different scholars, Hermann Feiner and Carl Friedrich. Hermann Feiner in 1941 made the argument that we need to approach ethics through external controls. The way in which we hold people accountable is by establishing very clear rules and regulations, very clear ethical expectations, and then imposing those rules and regulations on administrators. So it's a very much kind of a top-down, external, outside control type of approach that Feiner argued for. Carl Friedrich in 1949 argued the opposite. And he said having these very strict outside controls will simply not work unless we have administrators who have the character and the training to be predisposed to engage in ethical behaviors to begin with. If you have not trained your administrators well, if your administrators are not there for the right reasons, they don't have the correct interest in maintaining the public interest, then it's not going to matter how many rules and regulations you have. They're probably going to violate those rules and regulations anyway. So what we learned very quickly in the 1940s is we need this balance. We need a balance between the external rules and then the internal training and characteristics of our administrators. It's kind of like if you read the Guy Adams article, and in the beginning of the Guy Adams article, he talks about the difference between deontological and teleological. And in deontological, we focus on the act itself. In teleological, we look more at the consequences of that action. So it's kind of similar here. With Finer, you're taking a more deontological approach, looking at the actual rules themselves that will stop certain types of actions. In the Friedrich approach, you're looking at more of the teleological approach, in that you're looking more at the consequences, that if you have these rules and people aren't predisposed to follow these rules, the consequences are you're still going to have unethical behavior no matter what. So we realized the politics administration dichotomy was outdated. It wasn't working. It wasn't realistic. And I think we still assume the same thing today. A lot of people, when they talk about the Woodrow Wilson article, they say, what do you take away from the Woodrow Wilson article? The politics administration dichotomy. Well, yes, that's something that Wilson provided to us, but he also told us in that article that politics serve as the touchstone of administration. And a lot of people overlook that line. It's one little line in the article. Politics should serve as the touchstone of administration. By saying politics serve as a touchstone of administration, what Wilson is saying is that, yes, we can study administration, we can bring in all these administrative innovations from other countries, but we have to realize that those innovations will only work if they are in alignment with our political system, if they're in alignment with our political culture. The British political culture was very much a closed type of system. And so they could use closed examinations where not everyone was able to sit for and take those exams. Only certain people with certain training were allowed to take those exams. Our political system was a much more open political culture, so we had to take those closed examinations and we had to transform them into open competitive examinations that anyone could sit for and take those exams, because that better fit our more open political culture. So we've come to a realization that there really is more of a blending between the political and the administrative world than what Woodrow Wilson may have originally led us to believe. Today, in terms of ethical adherence, we take a much more contextual approach to how we hold people accountable for their actions. It's what's called on here an evolving policy problems approach. We've realized that the previous approaches are no longer relevant. We no longer have this top-down hierarchical chain of command that would allow for single professional norms to be applied in every single agency across the government. We've realized that every different agency has its own organization culture. And if you have worked with different organizations in your career, you've probably recognized the different cultures across those organizations. Before I came to the Cal State system, I taught at a university. It was a state university, but it was a new university in the Florida state system. It was called Florida Gulf Coast University. As a new university, its culture was a much more free-flowing, much more open type of culture, in that we didn't have a lot of the rules and regulations that we have in the Cal State system. The Cal State system is a large bureaucracy. Kind of regardless of which campus you're at, those campuses are probably going to be large bureaucracies. Northridge is a large bureaucracy. Long Beach is a large bureaucracy. At Florida Gulf Coast, it was not that type of a large bureaucracy. And so, one example is, along with a fellow faculty member, we decided we wanted to create an undergraduate program in political science. I mean, that's how new the university was. We had an MPA program, but we did not have an undergraduate program in political science. So we went to the provost and we said, we want to create this undergraduate program in political science. What are the procedures? What are the steps we have to go through? And his response was, I don't know, you tell me. You write the procedures. We've never created a new undergraduate program here before. You're the first ones to do it. You write the procedures that we need to follow. It was that kind of a much more open, freewheeling type of culture that you had at that university as compared to what you see here in most of the campuses at the Cal State system. So we have to recognize that every organization has its own culture, its own set of norms and values and expectations for behavior. And we then have to tailor our ethical adherence so that it fits with those individual organizational cultures. I love the school of thought of organization culture. And as we talk more in a future class about the theoretical perspectives on the study of public administration, we will talk about someone by the name of Sheen and organization culture. And we'll talk more about what those cultures look like. We'll talk more about how leaders can embed those cultures in their organizations. But essentially, the recognition that every organization is different means we cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to ensuring accountability. And that's kind of where we are today in terms of accountability in the public sector. But we've been throwing this word accountability around a lot so far tonight. But what are we holding people accountable for? There are three different, what we consider to be elements of accountability, three different things that we hold people accountable for. The first thing we hold people accountable for is what's called fiscal accountability. This is a type of accountability that we are all most familiar with today. You know, a lot of the examples that you're probably basing your public accountability and ethics paper on are probably based upon this idea of fiscal accountability. Fiscal accountability is concerned with whether agency officials are spending money on the programs they are charged with managing and only on those programs. One of the major differences between public and private sector organizations is this idea of the Anti-Deficiency Act. The Federal Anti-Deficiency Act says that public agencies may only spend money on programs that are authorized. They're only able to spend money on what they're authorized to spend money on. Private sector organizations can spend money on anything that they want as long as it's not precluded by law. So we can only spend money on what's authorized by law. Private sector organizations can spend money on anything they want as long as it's not precluded and not limited by law. That's an example of some of the major differences in terms of how we spend money in the public versus the private sector. We know in the federal budget process, the way in which the federal budget process works is for discretionary spending, Congress is supposed to, it usually doesn't do this because the process is irreparably broken, but the way in which it's supposed to do it is Congress is supposed to pass out 12 different appropriation bills, each bill for a different area of spending. So a defense appropriation bill, an education appropriation bill, an agriculture appropriation bill. Those appropriation bills will then say, here is how the money is to be spent. That's the appropriations process. Article 1 of the Constitution says that Congress, in its power of purse strings, must appropriate money before money can be removed from the federal treasury. It must say how that money is being spent. So in fiscal accountability, we are looking at, is this money being spent in the legally appropriated manner? So if you work with audits in your current position, your current organization, you're probably familiar with this in terms of what are called financial legal audits. A financial legal audit will ask the question, was the money spent the way in which it was supposed to be spent? When I was on the school board, we passed a $148 million general obligation bond. And as part of passage of that bond, we had to create a citizen oversight committee. That citizen oversight committee then had to authorize audits twice per year. And one of those audits was a financial legal audit to say, yes, the district spent all the money this year in this bond the way in which it was supposed to spend the money. It spent the money in the way in which it told the voters it would spend the money when the voters approved this general obligation bond. That is fiscal accountability. It's by far the most widespread form of accountability. And again, most of your papers are probably going to be based at least partly on fiscal accountability. The second element of accountability is process accountability. We hold people accountable for how they are doing their jobs and how agencies are performing their tasks. Oscar, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Powell. Are you able to go back and maybe further expand on what you referenced in terms of Congress unable to, at least recently, to pass this group of policies as established or should?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the way in which the federal budgeting process is supposed to work dates back into the 1960s in the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. And the Congressional Budget Impoundment Control Act says that whenever the president comes up with their budget then goes to Congress. And when it goes to Congress, it goes to a House Budget Committee and a Senate Budget Committee. From there, from the House and the Senate Budget Committee, it then goes to the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. Those appropriations committees each have 12 different subcommittees. Each subcommittee focuses on a different area of spending: agriculture, education, health and human services, defense, veterans affairs. They will all have their own individual jurisdiction. Each of those subcommittees will then pass an appropriation bill. That appropriation bill then goes back to the parent appropriations committee. Then from there, it goes to the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate to then be passed as an appropriation bill. As these appropriation bills are passed, and there are 12 of them, as they are passed by the House and the Senate, once they are passed in uniform version, they can then go to the president. The problem is all 12 of those appropriation bills are supposed to be passed by Congress no later than September 30th, which is the last day of the federal fiscal year. They then need to be signed by the president for the beginning of the new fiscal year on October 1st. The problem is, because of the way in which Congress has been operating and the partisan divisions in Congress, Congress over the recent years has been incapable of getting all 12 appropriation bills passed and sent to the president's desk by October 30th. Typically, what Congress will do is they'll end up passing maybe 3 or 4 appropriation bills, which will get signed by the president. So when the new fiscal year begins on October 1st, you only have legal authorization to spend money in those 3 or 4 areas where the appropriation bills have been passed. All those other areas that are covered by the appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, those agencies legally do not have the authority to spend money in this new fiscal year. So what Congress then has to do is it then has to circle back and it will pass what are called continuing resolutions. So it will say, for example, for those 9 different appropriation bills that we have not yet passed, for all those agencies and departments covered under those 9 appropriation bills, we will continue allowing you to spend money for the next 2 weeks at 80% of what you spent for those 2 weeks last year. So we'll give you legal authority to go ahead and continue your operations and spend money at a reduced amount compared to what you spent in those 2 weeks for the last fiscal year, just to kind of keep those agencies up and running. Problem with those continuing resolutions, as they're called CRs, the problem with those CRs is they are temporary. So they'll be for maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and then they go out of existence. Well, it's just Congress buying itself enough time to hopefully pass those unpassed appropriation bills. However, if those 2 weeks expire, the continuing resolution expires, then they either have to pass a new continuing resolution or all those parts of the federal government will have to shut down in what's called a partial government shutdown. So what Congress will do is they'll continue passing these continuing resolutions, usually throughout October and November and then into December. Eventually, Congress will get to the point, or the president will get to the point, where they'll say, no more continuing resolutions. We've got to get this done. At that point in time, when no one wants to do continuing resolutions anymore, then they're met with 2 choices. The first choice is a partial government shutdown. Shut down the government, all aspects of the government where the appropriation bill has not yet been passed. The second choice they have is to cobble all these unpassed appropriation bills together into a mammoth, huge piece of legislation called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA, an OBRA, an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. The problem with that is when they take all these unpassed appropriation bills and they throw them all together, in addition to all these appropriation bills going in there, you'll have all these other pet projects and what we call pork barrel spending that will go in there as well, because you have to convince members to vote for this OBRA. And the way you convince them is by throwing their spending, their pet projects in there as well. So it leads to a whole lot of overspending, and a lot of our overspending comes from these omnibus budget reconciliation acts. That's not the way a budget is supposed to be made. The budget, at least for discretionary spending, should come from those 12 appropriation bills. But because Congress is unable to do that, they end up budgeting through omnibus budget reconciliation acts. It's a very clumsy process. It's a process that leads to a lot of wasteful spending, but it's the way it's become the norm. It's the way in which Congress has made budgets pretty much every year over the past several years. Now, we are currently in September. This is September 15th. The fiscal year at the federal level ends on September 30th. So we have 2 weeks until the end of the fiscal year. And that's why Congress is scrambling around to try and get these appropriation bills all done before the end of this fiscal year. Again, if we don't get some appropriation bills done, then we're probably going to have to go into the continuing resolution cycle again. And that's kind of the cycle that Congress has found itself in over the past several years. That's why everyone says the congressional budget process is irreparably broken. And I think they can say that with a lot of good evidence. So this budget process that we try to adhere to dates back to the 1970s. And again, we're just very bad in Congress at getting budgets done on time. But in those appropriation bills, what those appropriations bills will say is they'll say, here's the amount of money that's being spent on Veterans Affairs, and here are all the things that are being funded in the Department of Veterans Affairs with this spending. So it's basically appropriations is Congress saying this is how the money is to be spent, the legal way in which money is to be spent. Now, the big caveat to that is in this current administration, we have seen this current administration engage in rescissions. And I think we mentioned maybe rescissions in our last class session. But a rescission is when the president decides that they are not going to spend the money that's been legally appropriated by Congress. So they'll rescind those funds. They'll refuse to spend that money. The current administration is using a rescission approach known as a pocket rescission. And what happened is Congress went out of session for their summer break back in August. And whenever the president rescinds funds, then Congress has 45 days to vote to release those funds. If Congress doesn't vote to release those funds within 45 days, then the presidential rescission becomes permanent. Well, what the president did is he rescinded those funds before Congress went out of session, but just before they went out of session, so that Congress would not have the ability to be able to come back in session and restore that spending within 45 days. So when those 45 days then expire, then that money is permanently rescinded. It's called a pocket rescission because, again, it doesn't give Congress the opportunity to release those funds. And so that's one way in which we've seen the current administration start to take back some of the power of the purse strings from the current majority in Congress. And it's kind of an interesting situation where we're seeing the president really start to dominate Congress, kind of to the will of Congress. And, if Congress wants to push back on this, they can push back on it. The majority in Congress has chosen not to push back on it. So that's how you kind of get that balance in power shifting between the executive and the legislature. Earlier on in the summer, the president did a rescission on other spending as well, and then sent a rescission bill to Congress, and Congress approved that rescission bill. So Congress approved the money that was being rescinded, saying it's okay that you not spend that money. So they agreed with the president in that rescission bill. The most recent one was a pocket rescission where they didn't even have the ability to consider it because they were out of session. So I know it's a very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's kind of the way in which the appropriations process works in Congress. Appropriation bills are used for what's called discretionary spending. So discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress decides we are going to reduce spending on this program, that's discretionary. They have the discretion to do that. Some spending in the federal budget is considered mandatory spending. So spending such as spending on the interest on the national debt, that's mandatory. Once Congress issues debt, Congress has to pay the principal and interest payments on it. It's legally obligated to do it. So Congress doesn't have direct control over saying we are not going to pay interest on the debt. So it's considered mandatory spending. Entitlement programs. So if it's a program that you receive benefits because you are legally entitled, that your income level is below the income threshold, which then makes you legally entitled to those benefits, those types of entitlement programs are typically considered mandatory spending as well. Because Congress, if it wants to spend less money on that program, would have to then change the eligibility requirements. So if you want to spend less money on Social Security benefits, you then have to go back and change the eligibility requirements. So you'd have to say, the new mandatory retirement age to get the Social Security benefits is now 70 years old. When you raise the retirement age for full Social Security to 70 or 72 years old, you are then reducing the pool of people who are then eligible for those benefits. You reduce the pool of people eligible for the benefits, you reduce the amount of money that you are spending on those benefits. And so that's an example of cutting a mandatory program through what's called authorization language. So discretionary spending goes through appropriations process. Mandatory spending goes through an authorizations process. Let's see, in text chat, mandatory spending, in my opinion, gives more opportunity to people to fraud. It's very, people can somehow make it seem that they fit the eligibility requirements when actually they do not fit the eligibility requirements. As long as it looks like they're fitting those eligibility requirements, then they're going to be legally entitled to those benefits, unless it can be proven that they don't fit those eligibility requirements. Mandatory spending is something Congress doesn't have that direct control over, and so it does, add a lot to the amount of money that we are spending every year. Social Security is a little different though, because Social Security is its own Social Security trust fund, so it's set off in what Al Gore referred to as a lockbox, and so it's kind of set off separately than a lot of the other funding in spending in the federal budget. So it's kind of a little bit different animal. I think if you think of something more like Medicaid spending, that would be something that would be more that would affect the overall budget as opposed to Social Security. But that's an example of kind of overview how the federal budget process works. But whenever we say, this is how the money is being spent, that's being done through the appropriations process. We are then held accountable for spending that money in accordance with the legally appropriate way that we are supposed to spend that money. That's what we consider to be fiscal accountability. Then in process accountability looks at the implementation of these policies and these programs and how we are implementing these programs, how agencies are performing their tasks. So is there gross incompetence or gross mismanagement of how we are implementing these types of programs? That would be considered to be a process accountability type of issue. So in your paper, if you're looking at the mismanagement of resources, the mismanagement of personnel, that's probably going to fall within the category of process accountability. But again, these three different accountability elements are not mutually exclusive. So it's very possible that the issue that you have chosen to talk about in your paper will cut across all three of these: fiscal accountability, process accountability, and then the third one is program accountability. Program accountability is concerned with whether a public program has achieved its purposes as defined in the law. So here we're looking at how effective the program or the policy is. How well has the program or policy achieved the goals and objectives that are spelled out in that program or policy's enabling legislation? So this looks more at the effectiveness of the program or policy itself. Process looks at how it's being implemented. Fiscal looks at, are we spending the money the way in which we are legally required to spend the money? Looking at this from more of an auditing type of perspective, a legal or financial audit will get you at fiscal accountability, and a performance or management audit will get at issues more of program and process types of accountability issues. So different types of audits for different elements of accountability. But again, it's really important to reiterate that your issue may cut across all of these different accountability elements. They are not mutually exclusive with each other. It's just fiscal accountability is the one that usually, when you see those stories on the nightly news, it's usually about fiscal accountability. Things like NBC News for many years had what they called the fleecing of America. And if you're old enough to remember that, but I think it was on a Friday at the end of their national news broadcast, they would have a segment, The Fleecing of America, and they would look at programs that are wasting taxpayer money and how the people who are administering the programs are wasting the money and not spending the money the way in which they're supposed to spend the money. Or sometimes they were focused on the actual effectiveness of the program itself, program accountability. There was one that looked at, a very famous one that looked at the impact of cow flatulence on the environment. And it was being a study being done by Michigan State University. And they had tens of millions of dollars of federal grant money in order to study the impact of cow flatulence on the environment. And that was an example that was given by NBC News in their Fleecing of America. So we try and hold administrators accountable for their actions. And the way in which we do it, we can do it in a couple different ways. One way, like Feiner told us before, is we rely upon external rules and regulations and controllers. Friedrich tells us we can rely more internally on the character of the people we hire and the training of those administrators. Whichever approach we use, we need to have insight into those public agencies themselves. Who knows what's going on within the agency than the people who are working within those agencies? We need to provide protections for people to be whistleblowers if necessary. So if people see that there are some problems with fiscal accountability or process or program accountability, do they feel comfortable enough blowing the whistle? Do they feel comfortable enough at the federal level contacting the Office of Special Counsel, at the state level contacting the state auditor, at the local level contacting their agency inspector general, or perhaps contacting a local county auditor? Do they feel that they are being protected from these whistleblowing types of activities? Let's see. Let me ask a question. Would that apply to the information that came out of Elon Musk's previous Doge? So much waste was reported. That was the original goal of Doge, was certainly to go through all these different federal agencies and all these federal programs and to root out all this waste and all this inefficiency, looking primarily at process accountability to see, are we spending money in inefficient ways and that we are wasting that money, mismanagement of funds. Their initial report, as Kane says, their original report was billions upon billions of dollars. And then later on, they very quietly scaled that way back because a lot of the funding that they took away, they then put back in again because they realized some of this funding was funding that was being used for things that we needed, such as regulatory of nuclear facilities. And so you can't eliminate these people who are maintaining and overlooking these nuclear facilities if you don't want to have a nuclear accident. And so we had to put that money back in again. And there are a lot of examples of how that money was then returned and reinstated. Some of those positions then reinstated as well. So I think the original goal was, yes, to root out a lot of this inefficiency and waste. Some was rooted out, but a lot of that money was then restored later on. Same thing with closing of SSA offices. Yep, absolutely. A lot of those local SSA offices were closed and they've now been reopened. I did have a student in a previous course. I think it was, I want to say it was over the summer actually. And he worked for the Social Security Administration. He was talking about just some of the changes during Doge. It was in the spring actually. Some of the changes that Doge had brought to the Social Security Agency, and how a lot of those changes actually led to more inefficiencies. And so, for example, everyone needed to have an appointment. And so you would have people go into their field office, their SSA field office, and they would wait 3 hours to talk to someone. And then when they talked to someone, the only thing that person could do was schedule an appointment for them to come back at a future point in time. And so things such as that actually built in more inefficiencies than already existed. There was very much of an argument between President Trump and Elon Musk on the what was called the Big Beautiful Bill, that Reconciliation Act that was passed several months ago, there was a lot of disagreement. And that Elon Musk didn't like that reconciliation bill. He didn't like the removal of a lot of the tax credits for EVs. And so he then made that very clear with President Trump. And then President Trump came back at Elon Musk. And that was kind of the source of their whole online breakup that they had a few months ago, that I guess they have reconciled a little bit, but it was very much a public and very messy social media breakup that they had. Question, what is the oversight difference between Doge and GAO? Great question. GAO is the Government Accountability Office. The Government Accountability Office is a legislatively created office. It was created through enabling legislation. It is headed up by a Comptroller General of the United States. The Government Accountability Office, what used to be known as the General Accounting Office, is an organization that was created by Congress. It was signed into law by a president. It has legal standing. Doge was a little bit different. Doge is something that was kind of created out of the White House. It didn't have its own set of appropriations, didn't necessarily have the same legal authority as the Government Accountability Office. And Doge had a goal in mind. And the goal in mind was to point out all these inefficiencies in the federal government. The Government Accountability Office, though, their goal is to do program evaluations of all these different programs that are being implemented across the federal government. Sure, to sometimes point out those inefficiencies, but also to point out some of the best practices as well. So the approach taken by the Government Accountability Office tended to be a more benign type of approach than what we've seen carried out by Doge. But I think the big difference is the legal standing between Doge and the Government Accountability Office. The Government Accountability Office produces literally hundreds upon hundreds of reports every single year, looking at how programs are being implemented across the entire federal government. It's a really good source if you are looking at a federal program, you're doing research on a federal program. GAO has always been a really good source to go to. If you are interested, you can actually sign up on the GAO.gov site. At least you used to be able to. I don't know if you can anymore, but you can sign up on their website to receive notifications every time they produced a new report. I had the misfortune of deciding to do that several years ago when I was working on research on a federal program, and it was just a deluge of notifications. They did so many reports in a given year, you'd literally get hundreds upon hundreds of notifications. But that's the primary difference, is just the legal standing in terms of how those organizations came into being. So it's important for us to maintain these individuals who are willing to point out ethical violations, maintain their existence within these organizations, so we have some insight inside the workings of the organizations. Whenever people blow the whistle, they have two decisions that they can make. One decision is they can decide to become the voice of the organization, which means they are going to remain in their position and they are going to remain there to be willing to blow the whistle on these ethical violations. People who choose to be the voice of their organizations are those individuals who are protected from reprisals. So they're the ones who feel confident enough that there won't be any retribution against them. They feel confident enough to blow the whistle. However, if we do not provide those whistleblower protections for those individuals, they'll make the second choice of exiting the organization. Once they leave the organization, then you no longer have insight into the inner workings of the organization. That's the worst case scenario for us in terms of ensuring ethical adherence. So we want to provide these protections to our whistleblowers from reprisal. The federal government has the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act. The state of California, we have our own California Whistleblower Protection Act as well. I have links on the slides to take you to a information sheet for the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act, as well as a link to take you to the California State Auditor site that talks about how the California Whistleblower Protection Act works. We won't spend time going to those websites right now, but you can look at those at your leisure. Just to give you a really quick synopsis, at the federal level, under the Whistleblower Protection Act at the federal level, if you are going to blow the whistle on an ethical violation, you can blow the whistle on a variety of different activities. So if you see a mismanagement of funds, you can blow the whistle on that. If you see mismanagement in terms of how a policy or program is being implemented, you can blow the whistle on that. If you see people who are getting retribution for blowing the whistle on something else, you can blow the whistle on that. And so you'll see that fact sheet will lay out to you several of the things that whistleblowers can blow the whistle on, and then the process that they go through in being whistleblowers. At the federal level, they can go to a variety of different places to blow the whistle. In the Obama administration created offices of inspector general in all of the federal agencies and departments across the entire federal bureaucracy. So if you are working in a federal agency where the Office of Inspector General still exists, you can go to the Office of Inspector General in your agency. Now, federal employees are finding out very quickly that the current administration has eliminated a lot of those Inspector General positions. So some of those offices of Inspector General no longer exist. But if it still exists, you can go there. If you want to go outside your agency as a federal whistleblower, you would then go to what's called the Office of Special Counsel, or the OSC. And we'll talk about the OSC in a future class when we talk more about civil service. But the Office of Special Counsel was originally created back in the 1978 Civil Service Reform Act. And then in this Federal Whistleblowers Act, it was given its own staff and its own budget. So the Office of Special Counsel is charged with hearing these whistleblower cases and investigating the cases of whistleblowers. So they'll go out there and they will do an investigation. If you take your case to the Office of Special Counsel and you don't get a response from them, or they don't close your case within 120 days, you can then take your case to another organization called the Merit Systems Protection Board, otherwise known as the MSPB, also created back in 1978 in the Civil Service Reform Act. Under the original Civil Service Reform Act, the Office of Special Counsel was actually created within the Merit Systems Protection Board. Then in the Whistleblower Protection Act, we pulled the Office of Special Counsel out and made it its own independent agency because it has such a backlog of cases that there was no way that it could respond to all these cases. But if you don't get a response within 120 days, or you don't get your case resolved in 120 days, you then can go to the Merit System Protection Board. The Merit System Protection Board has enforcement power. So OSC only does an investigation. Then the Merit System Protection Board can then do enforcement. And so if you have been removed from your position because you blew the whistle on an ethical violation, MSPB could then order you reinstated into your position and then order that the agency provides you with back pay as well. If you were passed over for a promotion because there was reprisal for whistleblowing, you could then be granted that promotion. So all those enforcement actions then get done by the Merit System Protection Board. So that's kind of how it works at the federal level. In the state of California, if you are a state of California employee, you can blow the whistle to your individual agency, or you can go beyond your agency to the California State Auditor's Office. And the California State Auditor's Office will then investigate your whistleblowing claim, but it will not engage in enforcement action. So it will conduct an investigation, but then that investigation will be handed over to another state entity, oftentimes an entity such as CalPERB, the Personnel Employee Relations Board, Public Employee Relations Board, I'm sorry, the PERB, the Public Employee Relations Board. And then CalPERB can then get into the enforcement of enforcing these types of things on your agency if they have engaged in reprisal against you as a whistleblower. As a local government employee, you can again go to your agency if there is an inspector general office within your agency, or if you want to take it outside your agency, you can go to a county auditor's office, and your local county auditor's office will then serve kind of a similar function as what was served by the California State Auditor's Office for California state level employees. So we have built in all these protections for our whistleblowers to try and ensure that these whistleblowers will feel comfortable and confident that they will not be have reprisals against them if they blow the whistle, if they witness any type of fiscal or process or program accountability issues within their organizations. The stronger the whistleblowing protections, the better able we are to make sure that people will choose to be the voice of their organizations as opposed to exiting their organizations. Now, there are some exceptions to the rule in terms of who can be a federal whistleblower, who's covered under the Whistleblower Act. So if you work in the intelligence community and you're in a security position, chances are you will be then exempt. The people who work, for example, in the Surgeon General's office are usually exempt from whistleblower protections. If you are a non-career member of the senior executive service, you will be exempted from those whistleblower protections. But those whistleblower protections are applied to the vast majority of career civil servants across the federal bureaucracy. So we know we have these higher ethical standards in the public as compared to the private sector. The problem with that is that you oftentimes see the experience of the shock of ethical upgrade when someone moves from the private into the public sector. And I've had several people I've worked with in this program and other programs who have moved from the private sector to the public sector, and they cannot believe the reporting requirements and what they would call the number of hoops that they have to jump through in the public sector compared to what they had to do in their private sector job. And again, it just makes sense. We have this ethical upgrade in the public sector because we obviously are managing public taxpayer resources. But this ethical upgrade can really provide a big challenge for us in terms of attracting applicants into the public sector. When people move from the private into the public sector, not only are they going to encounter a lot more rules and regulations they're going to have to navigate, they're probably going to encounter lower compensation levels as well, maybe lower benefit levels, depending upon where they're coming from in the private sector. What they will get from the public sector is they will probably get better career protections in terms of being a member of the civil service. Although some of those career civil service protections, especially at the federal level, are kind of up in the air now. We're kind of waiting for the Supreme Court to chime in on some of these dismissals that the current administration has done for current career civil servants. So we don't know how strong those protections are necessarily going to be going forward, but it is one of the benefits of working in the public sector. But one of the main benefits of working in the public sector to attract people into the public sector is being part of the public service. The ability to make lives better for others, to contribute to the public good, to contribute to the public interest. That's why it is so important for our leaders and elected officials to believe in public service. People like George H.W. Bush was a career government employee, and he called government service during his tenure the highest and the noblest calling anyone could have. President Obama, during his 2008 presidential campaign, said that one of the goals of his administration was to try and make government and public service cool again. We know that the federal bureaucracy, as well as state bureaucracy, just in general bureaucracy, the term bureaucracy is held in very low esteem by members of the public. The very famous book from 1970 by Charles Goodsell called The Case for the Bureaucracy told us as much, that people tend to have a very negative view of the bureaucracy based primarily on a negative experience they've had with a bureaucratic organization. So someone may have had 10 experiences with bureaucratic organizations. 9 of those experiences were good, but if they have that one negative experience, that could be enough to color their entire perception of public bureaucracies. So Goodsell tells us that one of our jobs as public administrators, as public leaders and managers, is to kind of engage in public relations in a way, in showing members of the public just how important public organizations are to their daily lives and how public organizations really do touch every single aspect of their daily lives, from the cars they drive to the clothes they wear to the food they eat. All of that is touched by government bureaucracies. We engaging in this kind of PR type of approach, we can show people that service in the public sector can be a fulfilling vocation because it has such a potential to impact the lives of so many people in society and the ability to make a difference. As department chair for 10 years, I read every single personal statement that came in from an applicant, which means I probably over 10 years read tens of thousands of personal statements. I mean, what? Yeah, probably that many, at least thousands of personal statements. If we admitted, 200 people per year over a 10-year period of time, that's over 2,000 personal statements. And in almost every single one of those personal statements those applicants had, they talked about the reason why they were in public service was to benefit their communities, to better the lives of people in their communities. And so I think that's one of the major selling points that we still have in the public service, where we can encourage people to serve in the public sector, even though they are going to have to adhere to these higher ethical standards than maybe they are used to in the private sector. Now, another thing that complicates the imposition and the holding people accountable for their actions in the public sector is that we have people entering the public sector from a variety of different professional backgrounds. We have public administrators who are engineers. In my program, we used to have a work site at the Orange County Transit Authority, OCTA. Every single person in the MPA program from OCTA was a professional engineer. They were civil engineers or whatever, they were engineers. So they came with their engineering background. The field of engineering has its own code of conduct. We also have other people who are finance managers, budget managers. They have their own code of conduct. We have people who are HR managers, and they have their own code of conduct. I, by training, am a political scientist, and so I have American Political Science Association code of conduct. But irrespective of the field we come in the public sector from, we are all public administrators. And so we need to have some uniform code of conduct that we all can adhere to. And that code of conduct comes to us from the American Society for Public Administration. ASPA provides for us a code of conduct that is predicated upon 8 different principles. The first principle is public interest, to promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. Number 2, to uphold the Constitution and the law. This is one of the reasons why we spent time looking at American government and the Constitution in the previous week. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. Number 3, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance, be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealings with public organizations. With social media today, with the explosion of the internet, if you work in a public agency, if you're a public official, you are probably being inundated with emails and social media contacts from members of the public. It can sometimes be frustrating, but it's something we do need to promote. We need people to know how to work with public agencies. We need to encourage their participation in their own governance. That is kind of the democratic part of our democratic republic. Strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, and equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. Now, I know that there are some shifting sands over the past several months in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts on the part of public agencies. So we're going to have to see how all of this plays out. It may become more difficult for administrators to adhere to principle number 4, but it still is a principle in the ASPA Code of Conduct. Number 5, to fully inform and advise. We mentioned this before at the principal-agent relationship. To provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. Number 6, to demonstrate personal integrity, adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in the public service. Number 7, to promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. And then number 8, sometimes one of the more difficult ones, advance professional excellence. strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. Unfortunately, in our organizations, whenever we are facing a budget retrenchment period, that retrenchment usually focuses, number one, on training and development programs. So a lot of those professional development programs are the first ones to go away whenever we are facing major budget cuts. But this principle would tell us not only do we have to work on our own professional excellence and development, but we have to encourage the professional development of others. This is especially important with succession planning. We know one of the problems in a lot of organizations is they do not have good practical succession plans. And so what happens is as people retire, the people who are then moving into those positions have not been mentored adequately enough, and we have a lot of loss of institutional memory. So it's important not to just advance our own professional development, but the professional development of others within our organization. So those are the 8 basic principles of the ASPA Code of Conduct that we all are expected to adhere to in our profession as public administrators. Now, one of the additional things that we try to do in a lot of states, as well as at the federal level, to assure ethical adherence is by having transparency mechanisms. The idea being that if we can open up the work of government through transparency to public inspection, and if the members of the public can see what we are doing, that transparency will then help us achieve ethical adherence. I think to a degree that is true. But if you've read the Adams article and the Bennington and Moore article, you'll know that transparency alone is not enough to get the job done. It's one thing to make all these actions transparent and open to the public. It's another thing for the public to actually care. And so if you don't have this collective feeling of what is ethical, what is not ethical, through what it's called the deliberative democracy type of approach that's described to you, I believe it's by in the Adams article, that if you don't have that agreement on what is ethical and the importance of ethics among the public, then you can still have people who violate these rules and regulations and the public know about it and the public not even care about it. So you need to couple transparency with cultivating this culture of ethics within your democracy. And if you can couple those two things together, then transparency can be an effective way of achieving ethical adherence. Here in California, we tend to refer to ourselves as a sunshine state for a variety of reasons. But one reason why we refer to ourselves as one of the sunshine states is because of all of our transparency mechanisms that we have to allow the public to see and participate in decision making. If you work with a city council or any other elected body, you're probably very familiar with what we have here in California in terms of the Brown Act. The Brown Act is oriented around making sure that the public not only are able to see decision making, but they're also able to participate in that process as well. So primarily the Brown Act, we won't go into all the different aspects of it, but the Brown Act is oriented primarily around making sure that the meetings of public bodies are conducted in public. So if you have a 5-member city council, and 3 of those members of city council are discussing a item that's within the jurisdiction of that city, that is a majority of the city council, that would then have to be agendized as a public open meeting. Now, if you only have 2 members of city council talking about something, that doesn't constitute a majority, and so therefore that would then not have to be agendized as a public meeting. However, you cannot have what is called a daisy chain in the Brown Act. And that would be an example of one member of city council talking to another member, and then that second member going and talking to a third member about what he discussed or they discussed with that first member, who then goes and talks to a fourth member. That type of approach would violate the Brown Act. So you can't do that. But all meetings that consist of a majority of members of the council would have to be done in the open and would have to then be agendized. It would have to be agendized at least 72 hours in advance so the public will have an idea of what types of issues are being discussed during that meeting, and then will have an opportunity to formulate their opinions and then make an appearance at that meeting if they would like to participate. At those open meetings, you then have to have time set aside for public comments. And so members of the public can attend those meetings and can comment on both agendized as well as non-agendized types of issues. Yes, very much like the LA County Board of Supervisor meetings, they have time for public comments. Every city council, every school board will have time for public comments as well. The way in which the boards and the councils will deal with those public comments will be a little bit different because the Brown Act provides some flexibility in terms of how you deal with public comments. The Brown Act allows governing bodies to set a reasonable limitation on the length of public comments. So some councils, some boards will give members of the public 5 minutes to speak, some will give them 3 minutes, some will give them 2 minutes. As long as it's considered to be a reasonable amount of time, then it will not get that board or that city council in trouble. Sometimes there's a misconception on the part of members of the public that they can come to public comment and they can talk as long as they want. When I was on the board, we had some members of the public saying, it's First Amendment. I can come here and say what I want, however long I want to say it. The Brown Act allows for those boards and those city councils to be able to get their work done. And so that's why those reasonable limitations are allowed on the length of those public comments. Where some boards and councils get in trouble is when members of the council will then respond to a public comment that's made on a non-agenda item. Members of the city council can only discuss items that are agendized, so only items that are on the agenda. If it's an item that's not on the agenda, they cannot have a discussion about it. So if a member of the public says something that's not on the agenda, you cannot respond to that as a member of city council, or else you will run afoul of the Brown Act. So these types of issues have to be covered in public open session. Those city councils and those boards can have executive closed sessions, and most of them will have at least one closed session attached to each of their open sessions. The Brown Act says that a board or a city council can only go into closed session out of open session. So they must start in open session and they can then go into closed session, but you're not allowed to start in closed session. That's one of the changes I made sure to make when I was on the school board, is that you can't start in closed session, you have to start in open session. Closed session, you are very limited in terms of the issues you can discuss in closed session. And so personnel issues, because they are personnel issues, they are confidential, they can be done in closed session. Disciplinary issues, because there are personnel issues, can be handled in closed session. When I was on the board, we spent some of that $148 million on hardening our school sites, retrofitting our school sites. Well, when you're talking about making safety changes to your sites, that's something you don't want to talk about the specifics in open session, because that's going to leave you vulnerable to anyone who can hear that and then exploit those vulnerabilities. And so those types of discussions you have with the sheriff's department or you have with your risk management firm, those occur then in closed session. Discussions you have with your legal counsel on existing or pending litigation, because it's litigation, that can also be done confidentially in closed session. But all those issues that are discussed in closed session are done confidentially, which means that as a member, you cannot then go out and talk about what was discussed in closed session. What you do have to do is you do have to report out votes that are held in closed session. So if there's a vote held in closed session, once you reconvene an open session, you would have to announce by a vote of 3-2 with members, X, Y, and Z voting yay and members, A and B voting nay, this motion number, whatever, was approved. So you have to report those votes out once you get into open session. But there are a lot of those types of stipulations in the Brown Act. If anyone's interested in it, I can put a link up on our Canvas site to a nice little synopsis of the Brown Act and all the different regulations that come out of the Brown Act. Again, the Brown Act's there for the purpose of transparency. But also here in California, we have a very open process for members of the public to request government documents. Communications between members of city council or between city council and staff, those communications, those documents can be requested by members of the public through the California Public Records Act. So any member of the public can put in a public records request. You don't have any specific form that you are required to use. So you can do it with just a simple email. So if you're interested in a contract that the city engaged in with the contractor, you could then submit a public records request just in a simple email saying, I am requesting all of the communications and documents pertaining to contract number, 123, and that then constitutes your public records request. Then that governing agency has 10 days to respond to that request. They do not have to provide all those documents in 10 days because sometimes it may take them weeks at a time in order to be able to gather all those documents together. We had one public records request several years ago that went back 15 years. And so they had to collect email communications over the past 15 years. If you are a member of a board or a city council, you use your personal phone, your personal iPhone or whatever type of smartphone you have for any type of district business, that is then also discoverable under the San Jose case in a public records request. But at least within 10 days, the agency would have to respond to the requester and say, it will take us X amount of time in order to get these documents together. Then some administrators will be in conflict of interest in reportable positions. If you are in a reportable position, you'll have to fill out a conflict of interest form. Usually it's form number 700. That conflict of interest form will require that the person in the reportable position reports any potential conflicts of interest that they may have. So if you have any business partnerships in the city, you would have to report those. If you own any property in the city other than your primary residence, you would have to report that as well. Any rental properties that you own, you would have to report. If you earn any income from any employers who are either located within the city or do business with the city, that income would also have to be reported on that conflict of interest form. The whole idea behind the conflict of interest form is just we are putting it out there that these are potential conflicts of interest so that when and if this issue comes up before the city council, we would then have to recuse ourselves from discussion and voting on that issue. So again, those are just examples of some of the transparency mechanisms we have here in California to try and improve ethical adherence. So to kind of wrap all this information up, accountability in the public sector really does require the striking of a balance. We need to strike a balance between these rules and regulations and then freeing up our administrators who have the flexibility and the freedom to make innovative and creative decisions, to allow them to be risk takers without fearing that they're going to run afoul of some of these rules and some of these regulations. We have to balance these rules and regulations with the ability to attract the best and the brightest into the public sector. We don't need to scare people away from working in the public service, but they need to be aware of the types of things they will be accountable for and held accountable for once they do become part of the public service. We have to balance these external rules with the internal training and characteristics of people who are being hired to work in our public agencies. Overall, the balance is between ethical adherence and effectiveness. We need to make sure we hold people accountable for their actions while still freeing them up to be as effective as they can be as public administrators so that we can best meet the demands of the public and very changing and very challenging demands that come at us from the public. So ethical adherence is very much about maintaining those types of balances within the public sector. So I've talked for a while. It looks like it's 7:40, so I think I've talked enough for one evening. But what I'd like to do now is we'll take a break. And then after our break, I'd like for us to come back and do this breakout group exercise. I'd like to break you up into breakout groups. And then what I'd like each group to do is to consider a recent example of an ethical violation. So think about, high profile ethical violations that you've seen in the public or nonprofit sector, and select one of those ethical violations to use as an example. As a group, discuss what happened in that situation. Which of those 8 ASPA principles you feel were violated in that example? How you think that problem should have been addressed. And then each group should select one spokesperson. And what we'll do is we'll spend probably about, by the time we get back from breaking belts, and we'll spend probably about 40 minutes or so doing this group exercise. Then we will reconvene as a class, and then the spokesperson from each group will then share out what the group came up with, and we'll kind of see how the answers from the groups are similar or differ from each other. And then the very last few minutes we have tonight will then answer any questions you have about the public accountability and ethics paper. So that's what we have planned after the break. But without further ado, let's take about a 10-minute break. If you can come back at 7:50, we'll then jump into these breakout groups. I will create the breakout groups. And so when we come back at 7:50, I'll put people into groups. We have 45 people in here tonight. So what I'll probably do is break us up to maybe 5 different groups, and I'll just randomly assign everybody into groups, and then we'll go at it at that point in time. But just take a break for 10 minutes, come on back at 7:50, and then I'll put you into groups and we'll do the exercise. Okay, I think that all our rooms are closed and everyone is back. So hopefully that was a good experience. Again, I think it's good that you get to work together a little bit, since you'll be taking courses together in the future, and give you a chance to get a little break from listening to my voice. So let's see really quickly what each room came up with. So let's start with room number 1. I think that was Anna Maria, Jennifer, Maria, Oscar, Ryan.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Oscar. I was designated to share what our group discussed. We we chose measure H, and we believe that is both a public and a nonprofit ethical issue in terms of what the intent was of the measure. Dr. Powell, I can keep going, right? I wasn't quite sure. Okay.
Yeah.
In terms of what the those of you may there was a initiative to the county, and do I need to explain it, Dr. Powell?
Just really briefly, just a sentence.
Oh, but essentially it was a measure placed on the ballot about 9 years ago across the county to raise funds to be able to address homelessness, housing, and other services. In terms of what we believe was the principles that were violated, it is the both 1 and 5 in terms of the administration of, the administrative public interest. I can't even read my own notes. And then 5, which is fully informed, to strengthen democratic principle. And then how should the problem have been addressed? We believe through more transparency in terms of reporting on the number of people served, also on reporting on deliverables and individuals housed. That's sort of the nutshell of things. I can't hear you, Doctor.
Dr. Paul, you are muted.
Indeed, I am. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Oscar, thank you very much. Thank you, room number 1. Very well done. How about room number 2?
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'm the spokesperson. We chose the same thing. We talked about but I mean, we talked more about LASA as an agency. One of the things that they did was misappropriate the Measure H funds. Um, they also we talked about the CEO and um, wanting to spend the money that was designated for homeless services on a Christmas party, and she wanted to buy booze. Also, she destroyed public records, asked to have them like emails destroyed. Um, and we also talked about how it's not just LALSA, it's also the county and the city's responsibility to have been overseeing this stuff. And this is not this the Measure H wasn't like the first sign of it. There's been other audits that have done where money was missing prior to this in the 30 years that they've been around. So in regards to the APS, they definitely violated the advance uh, of public interest. Um, they put their own agency and how they looked in front of the taxpayers' dollars. Um, I would say that the county and the city didn't respect the Constitution or the law in which, to fund these things, because it does have to do with the county board of supervisors and the city council, because they've known about this issue for so long, and now it's become the problem, and they finally did something about it, but it should have been addressed years prior. Um, I will say this, in regards to LASA, one of the things I know that they do try to do in regards to the people that they're servicing, they do provide social equity. Um, that is one thing they are highly focused on. Um, they never fully informed or advised, so they were, when it came to data, or, audit, stuff like that, they did not want to, allow information to be transparently seen, and numbers were always wrong. And then even the city controller, like the city, when the controller office did its own audit, and the audit came out from Judge Carter, they even wanted to not have all of the information released to the public because of, how it would make the city look as well. Um, and then where they demonstrate personal integrity, I feel like the CEO, Kellum, she definitely did not demonstrate personal integrity. She signed contracts that her husband worked for a nonprofit and he was a high-ranking official there, you know, um, between deleting the emails, getting outraged when somebody told her like, no, you can't use that money on the Christmas party, like that's not what that money is appropriated for. um and then yeah, so those are the things that I feel we all felt were violated. um and thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you, room number 2. Well done. Room number 3.
I I think I'm group number 3. Am I on that list?
Yes, you are.
All right, cool. I'll be brief. So the issue that we identified was the Flint water crisis. So in essence, kind of the contaminated water that impacted the public health within Flint, Michigan. What happened? Yes. So what principles were violated? Public interest was violated. Um, Promoting democratic participation as a means to inform city council, the state legislature, um, of their desires and hopes to identify a solution. So I will say the issue was the the city's own budgetary deficits, which then the emergency manager of the state decided to take hold of their budget, which in his attempts to balance the budget, right, decided to pivot from the Detroit water system to the Flint, Michigan system. Um, so that was an issue in of itself. Uh, strengthening social equity. So Flint, Michigan is a predominantly Black community, and so this has built inequitable or just health disparities that impacted the community. How should the problem have been addressed? There was different approaches or different discussions around whether that was a proactive approach or a responsive approach, right? So I believe, some considerations were to, one, of course, fully inform the public of the risk of the water itself, and having community input as to strategies and ideas for at least autonomy to make a decision to whether they wanted to stay within the community or leave. But I think those that are closest to the problem can also provide, or at least should have a voice in identifying a solution to the problem. Yeah, so those are some of our ideas.
Great. Perfect. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you. Room number 3. Well done. Room number 4.
I think that's us, right? Group 4?
That is you, yes.
Okay, so I'm Joy, and the issue that we decided on was an issue in Florida where the COVID vaccines were distributed inequitably, specifically using favoritism by the governor Ron DeSantis, but also in Manatee County. And this issue involved governor's office, the local commissioner, and the Florida Department of Health. And so basically what they did was they rolled out early vaccinations on pre-selected lists of basically VIP people that were donors or potential donors, and then people within wealthy communities, specifically wealthy zip codes, and then donors to those political campaigns. And then we agreed that this was a process and program accountability issue. We couldn't find any information that said anything about financial accountability, but probably at some point down the line. And then we agreed that it violated a lot of the code of conduct or the code of ethics. So definitely number 1, violating in public interest. Number 3, promoting democratic equal participation. Obviously number 4, strengthening social equity. Number 5, fully informing and advising. Number 6, demonstrating personal integrity. Number 7, promoting ethical organizations. And number 8, advancing professional excellence. So all of those things were violated. And then we agreed that some of the things that should have been done, I think I said to remediate, was obviously transparency of the state health authorities. So because it involved elected officials as well as public administrators, but like that the state health authorities had the responsibility of being transparent, but then also community oversight that really represented the actual demographic in Florida, because of a lot of people that have technological and language barriers. So a community oversight that actually represents the community. It also said like an audit, and then more accountability, possible investigations, and then definitely a rebalancing of the resources. So like after doing an audit, and then rebalancing the resources so that there is actual equitable outcomes. That was it.
Great. Very well done. Thank you, Joy. And thank you, group number 4. Nicely done. And room number 5.
All right. Hello. Good evening. My name is Eric. I am the spokesperson for group number 5. And for our group, we chose to talk about former Los Angeles City council member Jose Luis Bizarre, who was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison for partaking in bribery and corruption. From about 2005 to 2020, was involved in a series of backdoor deals with real estate developers, being part of sort of a pay-to-play scheme environment. And ultimately, he was ordered to pay restitution of $443,905. Yeah, so not making the best decisions and a chair of the council member. For the ASPA principles, definitely violated all 8. But for some just quick highlights, the 3 that we felt strongest about, definitely for the advancement of public interest. The projects that he made these backdoor deals for didn't really benefit the areas in terms of the needs that the things that they needed for resources in the public. And then in promoting an ethical organization, he clearly didn't abide by ethical standards and proceeded with such said backdoor deals. And those backdoor deals were secured. And he did not fully inform and failed to advise the public completely of how that money was flowing in, and how he settled certain litigation against him with the businessmen and people that he was doing these deals with. So in terms of how we felt like the problem was addressed, the sentence and the restitution was definitely substantial. However, we feel that maybe that all that restitution that he was ordered to pay was not entirely everything that he held in terms of the money that he had. So an idea that we kind of agreed on was that the public should have access to a housing fund, where maybe that money is coming from what he made for those deals, and then put it towards housing for the public, so that the public can actually benefit from what they potentially missed out on. And then, of course, just for the money and the funds that go into campaigns, or these members of the public who want to become administrators or hold public office, definitely stronger in oversight into all the funds that goes in and out. And so, yeah, what a fun little story.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, room number 5. Yeah, it is
Yes,
a
sir.
pretty amazing story, and this kind of boggles the mind just how obvious it was too. It's just, I don't know. And the problem with this is a good exercise, I think, because it allows you to, kind of rip from the headlines, pull out some of these instances that have happened, and then connect them to the ASPA code of conduct. But the bad thing about an exercise like this is sometimes it's kind of jarring to us just how many ethical violations are out there that we can choose from. It's there's certainly never a lack of these ethical violations, which is obviously concerning for all of us. But thank you very much. I hope the breakout groups were helpful for you. You can actually get to meet some other folks in the cohort. So thank you for that. Let me get rid of this, and let me go ahead and pull up, if I can find it here, our syllabus. I swear I had it open, and talk a bit about the upcoming paper. So what you have coming due next is you have the Canvas essay number 4, and Canvas essay number 4 is drawing upon these issues that we talked about before with ethics. You'll, for your Canvas essay number 4, you'll look at the different ethical standards between public and private nonprofit, in the public nonprofit sector as compared to the private sector. What are the implications of these ethical standards? How can the challenges and obstacles to the enforcement of ethical principles be addressed and mitigated? So just a quick discussion about some of the differences in ethical standards between the two sectors, and then how can we deal with some of the difficulties that we encounter that we talked about in class tonight in terms of trying to enforce these ethical principles. So let's Canvas essay number 4 and then 2 responses. But what I do want, a couple minutes left here tonight, is to circle back here to our public accountability and ethics paper and talk a bit about what you're doing on that, and clarify any questions or any concerns that you have about it. Again, the purpose of this public accountability and ethics paper is to allow you to explore a modern day ethical issue. And I know I've communicated with many people about the issues they want to use for the paper. And most of the feedback I've given is the more specific the issue or the more specific the occurrence, oftentimes the easier it is to write the paper based upon that. And so, like with group number 5, what Eric talked about, that was a specific instance of an ethical violation. I think it's easier to write the paper based upon a specific instance such as that. And so if you're kind of struggling to come up with an issue, narrow it down and think specific. And I think that probably would help you a lot with the paper. So based upon that specific issue, you're creating a 5 to 10 page paper. As I told you before, I am a big believer in parsimony and being as concise as you can be. So if you're closer to the 5 or 6 pages, that's absolutely fine. As long as you address the 4 elements I have listed here. A brief description of the issue that includes the nature of the issue and the actors involved. So what was the issue all about? Who was involved in this ethical violation? Number 2, a discussion of what types of accountability were involved, those 3 different types: fiscal, process, and policy. Again, your issue may not cover all 3 of those. It may only cover 1, may cover all 3. It really depends upon the issue. If your issue is only a fiscal accountability issue, then that's all you need to address there in the second part of the paper. Third part of the paper, analysis of how the issue was addressed and by whom. And then number 4, a description of how you would have addressed the issue and why. So those are the 4 things you need to include in the paper. Again, a very brief 5 to 10 page paper. Give me a title page, then you can go into each of these 4 different parts and then provide me with a reference sheet in which you include your 10 peer-reviewed sources. Now, for those 10 peer-reviewed sources, if you're looking at a specific ethical instance, you're not going to find 10 peer-reviewed sources on that specific instance. So don't get hung up on that. Don't worry about that. For peer-reviewed sources, you may have to broaden it out to the issue itself. And so, for instance, if we're looking at something like elected official who engaged in embezzlement, you're probably not going to find peer-reviewed sources on that specific instance of embezzlement, but you'll probably find peer-reviewed sources looking at more generally corruption and embezzlement in public sector. So it'd be a more general type of approach for getting those 10 peer-reviewed scholarly articles. So a reference sheet with those 10 citations on there, and those citations done in APA format. Don't use a lot of direct quotes, paraphrase, but I really want to know your interpretation of the issue, the instance that you were talking about, your answers to those 4 different parts of the paper. That paper then is due, I know I have in the syllabus, day 7 of week 4. Technically for me, day 7 is on Sunday. And so you have the entire week until midnight on Sunday. I am traveling and I'm going to be on the road beginning on Thursday, coming back on Monday. So I probably won't be able to review papers that come in between Thursday and Sunday, but I certainly will get to work on them next week and get them returned to you as quickly as I possibly can. I won't go through and line edit your papers, and so you don't have to worry about that. I will read the entirety of the paper. I will insert comments where important, but I will include feedback in that feedback box. And so, if you don't get a complete 100%, you know exactly why. But again, I will give you that feedback on your papers. So that's the public accountability and ethics paper due by midnight next Sunday. So any questions or clarifications on that paper?
Dr. Powell,
Yes.
as far as point number 2, where it says to discuss the type of accountability, if it crosses multiple sections, you want us to discuss each section or just choose one?
If it crosses over 2 or 3, discuss whatever types of accountability it actually addresses. So make sure if it's 2, then talk about those 2. If it's 3, talk about all 3. If it's only 1, then you only have to focus on 1. Good question.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a quick question.
Professor,
Yeah, please go ahead.
I just had a question. I see on the to-do list, it's the middle of the course survey. That's just a survey, right?
Yeah, don't worry about that because that's just kind of an informal type of thing. It doesn't count for anything. It's the end of course survey that actually counts. So if you don't have time to do a mid-course survey, don't worry about it. Just the final one is the one that really counts.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Professor, so my question is the issue that I'm choosing, it's like a pretty fresh issue. So there hasn't been like a lot. It's a local issue to me. It is similar to the topic Nicholas was talking about. Funds appointed for one thing but used for something else. Is it okay if there's only like very limited new information about it?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine. Yeah, I don't put, I don't put dates on, it has to be, 2024 or newer. I don't do that. And so, if it's something that was written, 10 years ago, it's probably still as appropriate today. So you don't have to worry about that. If it's older information, it probably is still appropriate.
And then is it also okay if because it is newer that people aren't talking about it as if it is an ethical violation yet?
Okay. Yeah,
That
if
makes
you
sense.
feel it is an ethical violation, then you can
Yeah.
certainly use it as the topic for the paper. In terms of the peer-reviewed scholarly articles, again, you may have to broaden it out. And so it may be more generally, it may not be specifically that exact issue, but something that is attached to that issue that has occurred in the past that's kind of similar to this issue, that would be fine for those peer-reviewed journal articles.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure. As you work on the paper, I know a couple people have already turned it in, and so thank you for that. And I've gone through and reviewed those and provided feedback. But as you work on the paper this week, if you have any other questions, feel free to send me an email. Like I said, I'm leaving town on Thursday, but I will have my laptop, I'll have my phone, and so I'll be connected. And so in the evenings, I certainly can answer any questions you have. So as always, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Okay. Well, it looks like we are bumping up against 9 o'clock, so I won't keep you late tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you for your participation. Thank you to each of our spokespersons who agreed to share with the results from your group. I truly appreciate your willingness to do that. I'll have this recording up on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning if you'd like to go back and review it. Otherwise, I hope everyone has a great week, and then I'll talk to you again next Monday. So take care, everyone.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.